Hello from San Antonio, Texas. This is Heavy D Storytelling. I'm David Sneed, and I'm going to tell a story this evening. Today's story, we're reading The Neverending Story. So we started yesterday, well, actually, it was 2 days ago. We skipped yesterday. And we are going to continue on in the story. Today is actually chapter 1. Last time it was the prologue. So that's why the title of today is called um, The Neverending Story, Chapter 1. So it's kind of a unique title. I know you weren't expecting it, but there it is, The Neverending Story, Chapter 1. So I see I have one viewer so far. I'll wait just a little bit. We will get back into the Bible reading in a few days, but for right now, we're going to start with Chapter 1, which is called Fantastica in Danger. And Kimberly just reminded me that she wants to tell us the synopsis. Are you ready to do that, Kimberly?
Yep.
Here she comes, just a minute. All right.
Okay, so there's a little boy, and he gets bullied at school, and there isn't like anything he can do about it. So he goes over, and by chance he runs into this bookstore. And after a bit of talking with the guy goes into the back room for some reason to like take a phone call. I don't know. But during the time he was on the phone, um, he steals the book the guy was reading. It was called The Neverending Story. That's why he stole it, because he loves reading. Just like me, I guess. But so he steals the book and he's like, oh, I can't go back to my dad, because he'd be like, school's over so soon, blah, blah, blah. And he'd be like, I can't lie to you, so nope, I stole this book. And so he goes over to the school and he hides in the attic and he gets ready to start reading. And that's basically all that's happened.
Okay, so that was our synopsis brought to you by Kimberly. So I am really sorry about the glare in my glasses. There's not much I can do about that right now. I don't have, yes? Yay, happy birthday, Daniel. So if you're online, please make a comment so that I know that you're here, because I see that there's one person, but I don't know who that is. So please make a comment. I like to see you guys. So without further ado, okay, that was interesting. All right. Without further ado, we're going to begin with Chapter 1, Fantastica in Danger. And I should take a picture of the marvelous letter A that they have so that everybody can see it. I'm going to turn this around here. In the prologue, it said that the chapters each had, it didn't have any pictures, but each chapter was started with a letter that was really fancy. So this is the letter that's really fancy in the first chapter. So there it is. All right. And obviously that is the letter A, and that is the first letter of chapter 1, Fantastica in Danger. All the beasts in Howling Forest were safe in their caves, nests, and burrows. It was midnight. The storm wind was whistling through the tops of the great ancient trees. The towering trunks creaked and groaned. Suddenly, a faint light came zigzagging through the woods, stopped here and there, trembling fitfully, flew up into the air, rested on a branch, and a moment later hurried on. It was a glittering sphere about the size of a child's ball. It moved in long leaps, touched the ground now and then bounded up again. But it wasn't a ball, it was a will-o'-the-wisp. It had lost its way, and that's something quite unusual, even in Fantastica, because ordinarily will-o'-the-wisps make others lose their way. Inside this ball of light there was a small, exceedingly active figure which ran and jumped with all its might. It was neither male nor female, for such distinctions don't exist among will-o'-the-wisps. In its right hand it carried a tiny white flag which glittered behind it. That meant it was either a messenger or a flag of truce bearer. You'd think it would have bumped into a tree, leaping like that in the darkness, but there was no danger of that, for will-o'-the-wisps are incredibly nimble and can change directions in the middle of a leap. That explains the zigzagging, but in a general sort of way, it moved in a definite direction up to the moment when it came to a jutting crag and started back in the fright. Whimpering like a puppy, it sat down on the fork of a tree and pondered a while before venturing out and cautiously looking around the crag. Up ahead, it saw a clearing in the woods, and there, in the light of a campfire, sat three figures of different sizes and shapes. A giant who looked as if the whole of him were made of gray stone lay stretched out on his belly. He was among almost 10 feet long. Propped up on one elbow, he was looking into the fire. In his weather-beaten stone face, which seemed strangely small in comparison with his powerful shoulders, his teeth stood out like a row of steel chisels. The will-o'-the-wisp recognized him as belonging to the family of rock-chewers. These were creatures who lived in a mountain range inconceivably far from Howling Forest, but they not only lived in the mountain range, they also lived on it. For little by little, they were eating it up. Rocks were their only food. Luckily, a little went a long way. They could live for weeks and months on a single bite of this, for them, extremely nutritious fare. There weren't very many rock chewers, and besides, it was a large mountain range. But since these giants had been there a long time, they lived to a greater age than most of the inhabitants of Fantastica. Those mountains had come over the years to look very strange, like an enormous Swiss cheese full of holes and grottos, and that is why they are known as the Cheesy Wheezies. But the rock chewers not only fed on stone, they made everything they needed out of it: furniture, hats, shoes, tools, even cuckoo clocks. So it was not surprising that the vehicle of this particular giant, which was now leaning against a tree behind him, was a sort of bicycle made entirely of this material, with two wheels that looked like enormous millstones. On the whole, it suggested a steamroller with pedals. The second figure, who was sitting to the right of the first, was a little nighthawk. No more than twice the size of the will-o'-the-wisp, he looked like a pitch-black furry caterpillar sitting up. He had little pink hands with which he gestured violently as he spoke, and below his tousled black hair, two big round eyes glowed like moons in what was presumably his face. Since there were nighthawks of all shapes and sizes in every part of Fantastica, it was hard to tell by the sight of him whether this one had come from far or near, but one could guess that he was traveling, because the usual mount of the nighthawks, a large bat, wrapped wrapped in its wings like a closed umbrella, was hanging head down from a nearby branch. It took the will-o'-the-wisp some time to discover the third person on the left side of the fire, for he was so small as to be scarcely discernible from that distance. He was one of the tinies, a delicate-built little fellow in a bright-colored suit and a top hat. The will-o'-the-wisp knew next to nothing about tinies, but it had once heard that these people built whole cities in the branches of trees, and that the houses were connected by stairways, rope ladders, and ramps. But the tinies lived in an entirely different part of the boundless Fantastican empire, even farther away than the rock chewers, which made it all the more amazing that the mount which had evidently carried the tiny all this way was, of all things, a snail. Its pink shell was surmounted by a gleaming silver saddle, and its girdle, as well as the reins fastened to its feelers, glittered like silver threads. The will-o'-the-wisp couldn't get over it that three such different creatures, should be sitting there so peacefully, for harmony between different species was by no means the rule in Fantastica. Battles and wars were frequent, and certain of the species had been known to feud for hundreds of years. Moreover, not all the inhabitants of Fantastica were good and honorable. There were also thieving, wicked, and cruel ones. The will-o'-the-wisp itself belonged to a family that was hardly reputed for truthfulness or reliability. After observing the scene in the firelight for some time, the will-o'-the-wisp noticed that each of the three had something white, either a flag or a white scarf worn across his chest, which meant that they were messengers or flag of truce bearers, and that, of course, accounted for the peaceful atmosphere. Could they be traveling on the same business as the will-o'-the-wisp? What they were saying couldn't be heard from a distance because of the howling wind in the treetops. But since they respected one another as messengers, mightn't they recognize the will-o'-the-wisp in the same capacity and refrain from harming him? It had to ask someone the way, and there seemed like little likelihood of finding a better opportunity at this hour in the middle of the woods. So, plucking up courage, it ventured out of its hiding place and hovered trembling in midair, waving its white flag. The rock chewer, whose face was turned in that direction, was first to notice the will-o'-the-wisp. "Lots of traffic around here tonight," he crackled. "Here comes another one." "Ooh, it's a will-o'-the-wisp," whispered the nighthawk, and his moon eyes glowed. "Pleased to meet you." Tiny stood up, took a few steps toward the newcomer, and chirped, "If my eyes don't deceive me, you are here as a messenger." "Yes, indeed," said the will-o'-the-wisp. The Tiny removed his red top hat, made a slight bow, and twittered, "Oh, do join us. We too are messengers. Won't you be seated?" And with his hat, he motioned toward an empty place by the fire. "Many thanks," said the will-o'-the-wisp, coming timidly closer. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Blub." "Delighted," said the Tiny. "Mine is Gluckuk." The nighthawk bowed without getting up. "My name is Vushvazul." "And mine," the rock chewer crackled, "is Björnkrakzark." Those are really good German names, by the way. Just let you know. All three looked at the will-o'-the-wisp, who was wriggling with embarrassment. Will-o'-the-wisps find it most unpleasant to be looked full in the face. "Won't you sit down, dear Blub?" said the Tiny. "To tell the truth," said the will-o'-the-wisp, "I'm in a terrible hurry. I only wanted to ask if by chance you knew the way to the ivory tower." "Ooh," said the nighthawk. "Could you be going to see the childlike empress?" "Exactly," said the will-o'-the-wisp. "I have an important message for her." "What does it say?" the rock chewer crackled. "But you see," said the will-o'-the-wisp, shifting its weight from foot to foot, "it's a secret message." "All three of us who have the same mission as you," replied Veshvazul the nighthawk. "That makes us partners." "Maybe we even have the same message," said Gluckuk the Tiny. "Sit down and tell us," Bjorn Krigzark crackled. The will-o'-the-wisp sat down in the empty place. "My home," it began after a moment's hesitation, "is a long way from here. I don't know if any of those present has heard of it. It's called Muldimur." "Ooh!" cried the nighthawk delightedly. "A lovely country." The will-o'-the-wisp smiled faintly. "Yes, isn't it?" "Is that all you have to say, Blub?" Bjorn Krigzark crackled. "What is the purpose of your trip?" "Something has happened in Muldimore," said the will-o'-the-wisp haltingly. "Something impossible to understand. Actually, it's still happening. It's hard to describe. The way it began was, well, in the east of our country, there's a lake. That is, there was a lake. Lake Foaming Broth, we called it. Well, the way it began was like this. One day, Lake Foaming Broth wasn't there anymore. It was gone, see?" "You mean it dried up?" Gluckuk inquired. "No," said the will-o'-the-wisp. "Then there'd be a dried up lake, but there isn't. Where the lake used to be, there's nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now do you see?" "A hole?" the rock chewer grunted. "No, not a hole," said the will-o'-the-wisp despairingly. "A hole, after all, is something. This is nothing at all." The three other messengers exchanged glances. Who does this nothing look like?" asked the nighthawk. "That's just what's so hard to describe," said the will-o'-the-wisp unhappily. "It doesn't look like anything. It's like, oh, there's no word for it." "Maybe," the Tiny suggested, "when you look at the place, it's as if you were blind." The will-o'-the-wisp stared open-mouthed. Exactly, it cried. But where? I mean, how? I mean, have you had the same? Wait a minute, the rock chewer crackled. Was it only this one place? At first, yes, the will-o'-the-wisp explained. That is, the place got bigger and little by little, and then all of a sudden Foggle, the father of the frogs, who lived in Lake Foaming Broth with his family, was gone too. Some of the inhabitants started running away, but little by little the same thing happened to other parts of Moldymore. It usually started with just a little chunk, no bigger than a partridge egg, but then these chunks got bigger and bigger. If somebody put his foot into one of them by mistake, the foot or the hand or whatever else he put in would be gone too. It didn't hurt. It was just that a part of whoever it was would be missing. Some would even fall in on purpose if they got too close to the nothing. It has an irresistible attraction. The bigger the place, the stronger the pull. None of us could imagine what this terrible thing might be, what caused it, and what we could do about it. And seeing that it didn't go away by itself but kept spreading, we finally decided to send a messenger to the childlike empress to ask her for advice and help. Well, I'm the messenger. The three others gazed silently into space. After a while, the nighthawk sighed. Whoo! It's the same where I come from, and I'm traveling on the exact same errand. Hoo! The tiny turned to the will-o'-the-wisp. Each one of us, he chirped, comes from a different province of Fantastica. We've met here entirely by chance, but each one of us is going to the childlike empress with the same message. And the message, grated the rock chewer, is that all Fantastica is in danger. The will-o'-the-wisp cast a terrified look at each one in turn. If that's the case, it cried, jumping up, we haven't a moment to lose. We were just going to start, said the tiny. We only stopped to rest because it's so awfully dark here in the howling forest. But now that you've joined us, Blub, you can light us the way. Impossible, said the will-o'-the-wisp. Would you expect me to wait for someone who rides a snail? Sorry. But it's a racing snail, said the tiny, somewhat miffed. Otherwise, the nighthawk sighed. We won't tell you which way to go. Who are you people talking to? The rock chewer crackled. Sure enough, the will-o'-the-wisp hadn't even heard the other messenger's last words, for it was already flitting through the forest in long leaps. Oh well, said the tiny, pushing his top hat onto the back of his head. Maybe it wouldn't have been such a good idea to follow the will-o'-the-wisp. To tell the truth, said the nighthawk, I prefer to travel on my own, because I, for one, fly. With a quick hoo, he ordered his bat to make ready, and whoosh, away he flew. The rock chewer put out the campfire with the palm of his hand. I too prefer to go by myself, he crackled in the darkness. Then I don't need to worry about squashing some wee creature. Rattling and grinding, he rode his stone bicycle straight into the woods, now and then thudding into a tree giant. Slowly the clatter receded in the distance. Gluckuk, the tiny, was last to set out. He seized the silvery reins and said, All right, we'll see who gets there first. Gyap, old timer, gyap! And he clicked his tongue, and then there was nothing to be heard but the storm wind howling in the treetops. The clock in the belfry struck 9. Reluctantly, Bastian's thought turned back to reality. He was glad the Neverending Story had nothing to do with that. He didn't like books in which dull, cranky writers describe humdrum events in the very humdrum lives of humdrum people. Reality gave him enough of that kind of thing. Why should he read about that? Besides, he couldn't stand it when a writer tried to convince him of something, and these humdrum books, it seemed to him, were always trying to do just that. Bastian liked books that were exciting or funny or that made him dream. Books were made up characters. where made-up characters had marvelous adventures, books that made him imagine all sorts of things. Because one thing he was good at, possibly the one thing, was imagining things so clearly that he almost saw and heard them. When he told himself stories, he sometimes forgot everything around him and awoke, as though from a dream, only when the story was finished. And this book was just like his own stories. In reading it, he had heard not only the creaking of the big trees and the howling of the wind in the treetops, but also the different voices of the four comical messengers, and he almost seemed to catch the smell of moss and forest earth. Down in the classroom, they were starting in on the nature study. That consisted almost entirely of counting pistils and stamens. Bastian was glad to be up here in his hiding place where he could read. This, he thought, was just the right book for him. A week later, Vushvazul, the night hob, arrived at his destination. He was the first, or rather he thought he was the first, because he was riding through the air. Just as the setting sun turned the clouds to liquid gold, he noticed that his bat was circling over the labyrinth. That was the name of an enormous garden extending from horizon to horizon and filled with the most bewitching scents and dreamlike colors. Broad avenues and narrow paths twined their way among copses, lawns, and beds of the rarest, strangest flowers in a design so artful and intricate that the whole plain resembled an enormous maze. Of course, it had been designed only for pleasure and amusement, with no intention of endangering anyone, much less of warding off an enemy. It would have been useless for such purposes, and the childlike empress required no such protection, because in all the unbounded reaches of Fantastica there was no one who would have thought of attacking her. But for that there was a reason, as we shall soon see. While gliding soundlessly over the flowery maze, the night hob sighted all sorts of animals. In a small clearing between lilacs and laburnum, a group of young unicorns was playing in the evening sun, and once, glancing under a giant bluebell, he even thought he saw the famous phoenix in its nest. But he wasn't quite certain, and such was his haste that he didn't want to turn back to make sure, for at the very center of the labyrinth there now appeared, shimmering in fairy whiteness, the ivory tower, the heart of Fantastica and the residence of the childlike empress. The word tower might give someone who has never seen it the wrong idea. It had nothing of the church or castle about it. The ivory tower was as big as a whole city. From a distance it looked like a pointed mountain peak, twisted like a snail shell. Its highest point was deep in the clouds. Only on coming closer could you notice that this great sugar loaf consisted of innumerable towers, turrets, domes, roofs, oriels, terraces, arches, stairways, and balustrades, all marvelously fitted together. The whole was made of the whitest Fantastican ivory, so delicately carved in every detail that it might have been taken for the lattice work of the finest lace. These buildings housed the childlike empress's court, her chamberlains and maidservants, wise women and astrologers, magicians and jesters, messengers, cooks, acrobats, her tightrope walkers and storytellers, heralds, gardeners, watchmen, tailors, shoemakers, and alchemists. And at the very summit of the great tower lived like empress in a pavilion shaped like a magnolia blossom. On certain nights, when the full moon shone most gloriously in the starry sky, the ivory petals opened wide, and the childlike empress would be sitting in the middle of the glorious flower. Riding on his back, the little night hob landed on one of the lower terraces where the stables were located. Someone must have announced his arrival, for 5 imperial grooms were there waiting for him. They helped him out of his saddle, bowed to him, and held out the ceremonial welcome cup. As etiquette demanded, Bushfazul took only a sip and then returned the cup. Each of the each of the grooms took a sip, and then they bowed again and led the bat to the stables. All this was done in silence. On reaching its appointed place, the bat touched neither food nor drink, but immediately rolled up, hung itself head down on a hook, and fell into a deep sleep. The little night hob had demanded it a bit much uh, had demanded a bit too much of its mount. The grooms left it alone and crept away from the stable on tiptoes. In this stable there were many other mounts, two elephants, one pink and one blue, a gigantic griffin with the forequarters of an eagle and the hindquarters of a lion, a winged horse whose name was once known even outside of Fantastica, but is now forgotten, several flying dogs, a few other bats, and several dragonflies and butterflies for especially small riders. In other stables there were still other mounts which didn't fly but ran, crawled, hopped, or swam, and each had a groom of its own to feed and take care of it. Ordinarily, one would have expected to hear quite a cacophony of different voices, roaring, screeching, piping, chirping, croaking, and chattering, but that day there was utter silence. The little night hob was still standing where the grooms had left him. Suddenly, without knowing why, he felt dejected and discouraged. He, too, was exhausted after the long trip, and not even the knowledge that he had arrived first could cheer him up. Suddenly, he heard a chirping voice. Hello, hello, isn't it my good friend Vushvazul? So glad to have finally made it. The night hob looked around, and his moon eyes flared with amazement, for on a balustrade, leaning negligently against the flower pot, stood Gluckuk, the tiny, tipping his red top hat. Hoo, hoo, went the bewildered night hob, and again, hoo, hoo. He just couldn't think of anything better to say. The other two haven't arrived yet. I've been here since yesterday morning. Hoo, hoo, hoo. How did you do it? Simple, said the tiny with a rather condescending smile. Didn't I tell you I had a racing snail? The night hob scratched his tangled black head fur with his little pink hand. I must go to the childlike empress at once, he said mournfully. The tiny gave him a pensive look. He said. I put in for an appointment yesterday. Put in for an appointment? Asked the night hob. Can't we just go in and see her? I'm afraid not, chirped the tiny. We'll have a long wait. You can't imagine how many messengers have turned up. Hoo, hoo, the night hob sighed. How come? You'd better take a look for yourself, the tiny twittered. Come with me, my dear Vushvazul. Come with me. Two of them started out. The high street, which wound around the ivory tower in a narrowing spiral, was clogged with a dense crowd of the strangest creatures. Enormous Betterband dins, tiny kobolds, three-headed trolls, bearded dwarfs, glittering fairies, goat-legged fauns, nixies with wavy golden hair, sparkling snow sprites, and countless others were milling about, standing in groups, sitting silently on the ground, discussing the situation or gazing glumly into the distance. Vushvazul stopped still when he saw them. Who, he said. What's going on? What are they all doing here? They're all messengers, Gluckuk explained. Messengers from all over Fantastica, all with the same message as ours. I've spoken with several of them. The same menace seems to have broken out everywhere. The night hob gave vent to a long, wheezing sigh. Do they know, he asked, what it is and where it comes from? I'm afraid not. Nobody knows. What about the childlike empress? The childlike empress, said the tiny in an undertone, is ill, very ill. Maybe that's the cause of this mysterious calamity that's threatening all of Fantastica. But so far, none of the many doctors who've been conferring in the Magnolia Pavilion have discovered the nature of her illness or found a cure for it. That, said the night hob breathlessly, is terrible. So it is, said the tiny. In view of the circumstances, Vusfazul decided not to put in for an appointment. 2 days later, Blub, the will-o'-the-wisp, arrived. Of course, he had hopped in the wrong direction and made an enormous detour. And finally, 3 days after that, Bjornkrazark, the rock chewer, appeared. He came plodding along on foot, for in a sudden frenzy of hunger, he had eaten his stone bicycle. During the long waiting period, the four so unlike messengers became good friends, From then on, they stayed together, but that's another story and shall be told another time. That is the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called Atreyu's Mission. The first letter is B. So I'm going to take a picture of the B for you. And you can see what it looks like here. I need to switch screens to make sure that I'm in it. That's what the B looks like. It's hard. I know there's a glare, so it's hard to see, but you can see it's really fancy. Doo-doo-doo. All right, so who says we read another chapter? All right, I got 3 me's. Make a comment if you think that we should read another chapter. Are we really dragging on the? Okay, so it'll take her a minute to. Let me see if people are awake or not. Daniel, are you awake? Daniel's asleep. JJ, are you awake? JJ's asleep. I think we should call it quits for the day. But tomorrow we'll get into the second chapter, Atreyu's Mission. And so that is chapter 2 of the Neverending Story. I'm looking forward to what happens. I don't remember the whole book, but I do know that it followed. Well, the movie follows the book for a little while, and then basically um, does what books do, is that they have a nasty habit of not following movies that are based on them. I can't believe how could Michael End have not thought that they would have changed the movie to suit their own purposes. But nonetheless, it is a good story, and I hope you're enjoying it. We will be back tomorrow night. I can't guarantee the exact time at this moment when we'll be back tomorrow, but I will be back tomorrow night. All right, God bless you guys. Have a good night, and we will see you tomorrow when we tell another story.